Hello and welcome back. This is part 5 of my comment, reaction, deconstruction of absolute philosophy, or better known as Dr. Nathan Hawkins' video, The Case for Idealism, Truth, Facts and Existence. So, as I pointed out recently in the prior parts of this, I don't think you can make a case for idealism because it's not a case. It's not, when you're building a case, you pick case, by the terms used, you are trying to find evidence. But evidence is an appeal to empiricism. And if you're creating idealism, which either may be considered by him a metaphysics or an ontology, or both may be, right? You have to, that's what you have to establish in order to have an idea what you mean by empiricism, right? It's the ontology that is the toolbox you're referring to when you're talking about that is what I mean by evidence, which implies empiricism, right? And that would, but if I say, well, I can consider a cognition like elephant evidence, right? Then I would have to say, there's evidence over there, elephant, right? And that would be a fact, in my opinion. To me, elephant is a fact. The facts are that which can be empirical, right? And what do you understand by existence? Well, then maybe he has his own definition what he means by existence. I would say that existence is something that is ex or extra or beyond or outside, right? So when you talk about existence, you're not talking about your stomach pain or something like that, right? You could say in a way it is, because outside mind is when stomach is, even if it's your stomach, that part is outside your mind, and maybe that's a kind of existence. But it depends on the definitions you're having, right? The definitions you are using, right? So existence might be even outside your own body, because then existence makes sense when you try to communicate the idea of existence, that it's something that can be agreed upon, right? And then when you want to agree upon a fact, you can make a proposition about it in order to agree, because you can't extend what you know without communicating it, in my opinion, right? Because you have that experience you claim to know. So in order to agree with somebody else, you need to propose it. And that's also one thing he's dealing with, but not particularly well, in my opinion. He's as confused as all the philosophers he's been trained to understand are confused, right? So when you say that's an elephant to somebody else, or make that proposition, somebody else can say that proposition is true or false if they agree with you on that particular definition of what can be known and what is meant by existence and what is knowledge, right? And therefore, if the proposition is in agreement, in concordance, the knowledge part of the proposition is in accordance with what you experience, then it's true. That proposition is true, right? That's what propositions can be, true or false, right? Or you can be in a situation where you have to say, I don't know, because I can't get to a place where it can be either true or false, right? So it depends on where you are in relation to that which the proposition supposedly points to, right? That has nothing to do with idealism, in my opinion, right? Idealism being a ontology / or a metaphysics, right? All that I've just described, the truth, fact, and existence, these, if anything, they are dealing with epistemology, right? And I like shit to be categorized correctly and ordered correctly. As I pointed in a lot of videos dealing with Bernardo Kastrup, when you can't do everything at once. You can't start with metaphysics and then draw upon epistemology. And later when you're doing epistemology, then draw upon idealism or metaphysics or ontology. Or maybe you can, but you can't do both of these, right? If you need ontology in order to do epistemology, you can't do ontology using epistemology because you needed to have settled that ontology / metaphysics before you did the epistemology. And this confusion seems to be everywhere in all people dealing with these particular, very, in my opinion, sharply delineated kinds of philosophy, which is ontology / metaphysics and epistemology. You cannot do epistemology before you settle that which comes before epistemology. You can't mix the bag around like that, right? I say, okay, I'm going to talk about truth and facts in order to establish that which I need to have established in order to get to an idea of what I mean by truth and facts. So that's the foundational confusion that I'm addressing, or one of them maybe, right? Among all the other things that sort of confused here, right? Using a lot of terms without addressing or without serving a foundational philosophy where I can reference them, right? Like, facts, things, world, mind, reality, existence, object, truth, thought, certainty, theory of truth, belief, knowledge, identity, entities, language, and outside, right? These are, maybe I should actually, that outside is a particular, if I open the actual, this outside thing, right, is a very particularly important aspect, in my opinion. I'll just do like this, so it's more easier to follow, right? This one, that. So, when you're talking about direct references, like a fact or a thing or a world or a mind or that is smaller or larger aspects that are directly referenced by the term, right? When you're dealing with something that is outside, you are implying at least a dichotomy, right? If you say this is outside, well, then there must be an inside, right? It follows from the term. So this is more like, outside is more like a relative term. Outside compared to that which is inside, right? So when you start to talk about outside, you're implying an inside. And how did you get to this dichotomy? Well, just by starting to say outside, you are not addressing that dichotomy you just brought in to the table, right? And it's this kind of, I would say, somewhat sophist approach is not good philosophy. I call this midstream philosophy, and I'm kind of inspired by, I actually think it's Stefan Molyneux who mentioned this sort of criticism reading some Ayn Rand. But I like the term, right? I'm not particularly fond of Stefan Molyneux or Rand for that matter. But the idea of it, the term is sort of you jumping into the river and being, a biologist, and you're saying, I'm describing all the water here and the weed in the stream and the rocks at the bottom, and there's a fish there, and there, done, philosophy, right? Or biology, right? That doesn't work. You can't just jump in and, right? You have to have the full picture in order for it to be good philosophy, because if you're just dragging in various shit that you are just bringing in along in your philosophical backpack, that implies a prior or proto-ontology or proto-metaphysics or proto-whatever, epistemology, an idea of knowledge, right? I'm not buying that. So, and thereby, I'm sort of recapitulating, the shit I've been doing so far, right? What thereby you're actually doing is, you are saying, okay, I can just bring this shit along without explanation, but now I'm going to explain some shit, right? Why do you need to explain that if you could just bring this other shit along in your backpack? Why doesn't that need to be disclosed, where the hell that came from and what it's referencing actually in your philosophy? Deeper levels possibly of your philosophy, right? So there's a lot of problems in it, because idealism is, to the best of my understanding, a very foundational kind of thinking. So how can you bring all these terms along to something that is foundational? Is there something that is even more foundational from where these terms are stemming, right? And it's sort of this also, as I pointed out, this I don't need to explain, I'm just bringing terms along. But I'm using this term I don't need to explain in order to explain something else that actually apparently needs to be explained. Why? This doesn't need to explain, but that which I'm not explaining, I'm using to explain some other things that apparently for some weird reason needs explaining, right? And I can use this in a unexplained backpack shit to explain something that is actually more foundational, supposedly, or I think, than that which I'm, grabbing out of that backpack. So it's sort of, it's kind of a circularity, unfulfilled, unexplained circularity. And I don't understand why these sort of philosophers can't see this. And I'm sort of, the explanation I would grab would be that they're trained to do it like this, right? When you go to university, they just throw shit at you. I once, some 10 years ago, I saw the starting, what's it called? Not the curriculum, but the first semester, what you have to go through, I don't remember the term, right? But what you have to go through in the first semester of philosophy in Copenhagen University, right? I saw a list of, or at least the beginning of it, right? And it was just sort of all over the place. Oh, you have to, this book and that book and this book and some paragraph over here, and then sort of, it was non-foundational. It was just grab shit from everywhere and put it together, and then the teachers probably having a very good idea of what conclusion you should reach from these cherry-picked various shit from all over the place, right? That's how philosophy is done nowadays. They are basically gaslighting into thinking you're a philosopher, but you're actually just severely confused on a higher plane, right? You're trying to actually not do foundational philosophy because you've not been doing that in university, and because they're supposedly some of those truth carriers, right? Truth bearers. You just obey your masters. So that's how I see it, right? So, okay, so now apparently we are going into ontology after almost half an hour of various, more or less useful, cursory discussion, right? Okay, so let's hit it.
The way ontology is regularly done in contemporary analytic philosophy is via a logical analysis of language and what the truths of that language say about the nature of existence.
Yeah, well, that's then fucked up, right? That's not how you do it. What came first? The world described, or the terms used to describe the world? If you're just the world, whatever the words describe, or attempt, at least in some aspects, to describe, what came first? That world or the words describing them? Well, it must be the world then, right? Or whatever it is you like to call that which words attempt to describe. So you can't go the other way and then look at the words and fabulate about what they describe, because the world came first then, and then words appeared when human beings started to make noises, right? A language appeared, right? And this is sort of backward. It's a backward approach. You have to start with your experience, at least, right? The world, in this sense, is your experience, in my opinion, right? And you can listen to my ontology, which is there should be a link down here below, actually, I think, or at least in the recent videos, right? My ABC ontology and other similar presentations, right? which is basically my experience. All of that which I can refer to, even that language I might be producing or receiving, quote, is a part of my experience. It's all my experience, right? So I had that experience before I started to communicate about it, right? So why would I then, if there's some kind of, language, in my opinion, hasn't evolved necessarily to be very precise about describing that experience, right? Language, if anything, it has evolved to manipulate other human beings to do shit they might not otherwise do, right? Threaten them or fuck with their mind so they do what they're told, their children and, upbringings and universities and so on, right? An objective standard, what usually is called a sort of a rational approach to language, is the exception rather than the rule, right? So in my opinion, unless you're actually making a proposition, and the proposition as I would define it, right? Which I have attempted to do, at least attempted to in the prior videos to this series, in this series. I consider that if it's not a proposition made, then it's probably some kind of manipulation, right? And the one extending that might not even understand that that's what they are actually doing, because they have been screwed around with and thinking they're doing something rational, right? So unless it's a proposition like that's an elephant, that's a pizza, or something like that, I consider language to probably be a kind of manipulation. It might not necessarily be nefarious or very nefarious manipulation, but it's kind of manipulating your understanding of your experience. What else could it possibly be? Because it's accessing your experience using sound. So it's manipulating your experience, or at least your interpretation, understanding of it, right? So unless that language is pointing to some direct knowledge, empirical knowledge and fact within your experience, it's probably there to manipulate your emotions and your interpretations and your understandings and your fear responses and all that shit, right? That's what language is there for, right? So don't use language to explain anything. It's merely to convey something, right? And you could say, well, I'm doing philosophy here. Yeah, maybe you should consider what I'm presenting. I've said somewhere else, if I don't consider something a proposition or pure philosophy, I've always said, right? And I'm trying to excuse myself here, maybe, right? But if I'm at the same time saying, this is my philosophy, I'm not trying to wake up. Don't just eat this raw, right? I'm doing my best to avoid manipulating people, you could say, right? But that's not necessarily the case with all philosophers. On the contrary, I would say, right? They want to manipulate your mind to think in a certain way. Some of the most manipulative people are philosophers, I would think, right? Or it's dangerously close, right? If you don't get what you want, you might swap over and become a sophist, right? So I'm rambling a bit here, right? I'm sort of losing kind of track of where I'm going. But maybe we should get back into this, right? Yeah, he talks about language. Language can never be the starting point, right? Come on, man. You can't. It's like saying mute people can philosophize of foundational stuff, right? Like, give me a break, man. Philosophy is not about language. Philosophy is about thinking, right?
This approach is linked to a dictum made by the highly influential 20th century philosopher W.V.O. Quine, who said, "To be is to be the value of a bound variable."
Oh my God. Yeah, so these kinds of statements I fucking hated, right? This is sort of, I'm defining this and I'm bringing in 4 new terms I haven't disclosed what means. Then you're sort of left, okay, so to be is to be. What is value? What does it mean to be bound? And what does it mean to be a variable, right? So now you need to define these three words. If these three words don't need definition, why does this term be need definition then? And if they do need definition, why are you not supplying the definitions? I fucking hate these academic philosophers. They're only making things more confused because none of them are doing foundational philosophy. They're midstream philosophers because that's how they survive. This is about survival. These academic philosophers of the 20th century, it's all about survival. I have more respect for, Friedrich Nietzsche sitting in some cottage somewhere, selling 170 books or something, right? Than these champagne philosophers of academia, just throwing around terms left and right. This influential Quine, yes, he was a philosopher and he was a professor, right? Give me a break.
Let me explain. Somewhat technically, what Quine is taken to have meant by this is that what exists is determined by the things you accept into your logical theory.
Okay, so it's open for interpretation. This is what he might have said. Well, I don't like to interpret. If you're doing foundational, rigid philosophy, you don't need to interpret or explain anything, right? Or it's very little. It might not be completely unavoidable, but just throwing terms out like this, right? This to be is to be the value of a bound variable. Fuck you, man. Okay, now I know how to go around my grocery store and how to apply my bicycle racing or whatever, right? Give me a fucking break, man. To be is the value of a bound variable. Oh, man, right?
Let me explain. Somewhat technically, what Quine is taken to have meant by this is that what exists is determined by the things you accept into your logical theory of language.
So what do you accept? So if there's no language for it, it doesn't exist. It's stupid, right? Well, the first time somebody made a sound and somebody recognized it as something that could be what we could say the beginnings of a language, they said something, and they were pointing at a goat, right? Right? So nothing existed at that point other than goats, or a goat, that goat over there, right? So Augie said and Noggy said, my God, that's a language. It's something like, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which is a great movie, by the way, right? If you're philosophically inclined. So there was only goats and nothing else existed. And then he said, and he pointed to a cat, right? Then means cat, means goat, right? And if the other apes in the congregation there start to say and for various shit, right? And kept making these noises. Some kind of, you could say, language, but it's about, as you to riff on 2001 A Space Odyssey. It was more important that you had this tool that you could use to kill and get what you want, right? And, manipulate the monkeys in the tribe. Then you could point and make, rational languages for all potential cognitions that you could make. So this language approach is a fucking dead end. It's stupid, in my opinion, right? It's fucking ridiculous.
The bound variables in a theory range over, that is, can refer to, the objects in the domain of the theory. And the domain of a theory must include...
Well, you don't have a theory about knowledge. Because, a theory is... If you take the theory of gravity, right? A theory of gravity is basically taking the shit that you observe in a particular fashion, a particular kind of pattern, and saying, when you have this and you have that, this is probably what is going to happen, right? if you have the Earth and the Eiffel Tower and you walking with your car keys, right? Or a beaver, as I've done, but I don't want to, be nasty to beavers, right? But bring the beaver up the Eiffel Tower, let the beaver go, and the beaver moves towards Earth, right? And then you take your car keys, and then you take your soft ice, and then you take your grandmother, or whatever, and let it go, right? And it does the same thing. It's the same pattern, right? It describes to say, maybe there's something going on here, right? Let me call that gravity. And the theory of gravity is that when this is the case and that is the case, this is what is going to happen. That's the theory, right? You don't have a theory about beavers, right? You don't have a theory about Earth. Because it's a cognition. You needed the cognitions in order to get to observe the pattern, right? Then you can turn it around and say, now I'm going to make a theory about that which I'm using in order to get to the theory of these cognitions and how they behave. It's the circularity that I don't understand why they can't see this.
All the objects that theory talks about. So, by Quine's dictum, the things that exist are the things that your logical theory of language talk about. You can think of this approach as mimicking a certain conception of science. You first of all get your best scientific theory, the one you think is
But as I pointed to in the early part, how does he get around his refrigerator? How does he get his underwear on, right? Or his pants or his trousers, right? How does he do that? If he doesn't have a model of what he's doing. And observing facts and existence and truth is, I need to put on trousers now. Are those trousers, is that proposition true? You're not stating it, but sort of following a sequence of thinking. Well, if you have to discuss this, how did you get your pants on? How did you get that haircut, right? How did you put your sweater on, right? Why? You're doing it from some kind of ontology or metaphysics or understanding of knowledge. Why are you not presenting that which you're already using, rather than sitting there pretending that this hasn't been solved yet? Right? What you're implying by what you're doing and how you're acting or how you look is implying something that you're actually sitting here pretending not to have an understanding of. Or at least that's what maybe the case for idealism, right? You're sort of implying a lot of questions as if you haven't answered them. And if you have answered them, why are you not just presenting the philosophy from A to B to C to D and so on, right? The notion I get at this point is, this guy wants to be a part of the academia, right? He wants to be known, so he creates a channel that discusses these things and jump on a few philosophers like Bernardo, Kastrup and so on and criticize them. But so he sort of gets noticed and then gets invited to seminars and so on, so he can live his philosopher life, right? But he's not really diving in, putting head on the block, and settling on something, or at least approaching some foundational philosophy here. It's just words thrown up in the air, right?
Probably true, and then you see what that best scientific theory talks about. If your best theory...
But why are you talking about scientific theories? Now you are doing ontology, right? This chapter or this timestamp period, time scope is ontology. What is an ontology? You're talking about language. Just because somebody made a sound doesn't mean there is an ontology. A sound has to be interpreted, right? You are the interpreter of these sounds, even the sounds you make, right? That doesn't create an ontology, because the sounds have to describe that ontology. So you can use the sound to extract an ontology without having that ontology already, and that then is undisclosed, right?
He talks about dark matter, strings and the Higgs boson. You say that dark matter, strings and the Higgs boson exist. Similarly, if your best logical theory talks about possible worlds, numbers and sakes, then possible worlds, numbers and sakes exist. The upshot of this approach to existence is that philosophy...
Okay, so if I say Santa Claus exists, unicorn exists, 20-legged pizza dough eating worm with... just make shit up, right? It exists. No, it doesn't. Maybe I'm overdoing it a bit, but it's really the cart before the horse problem here, right? You can't use a language. Language is just sounds you have been trained to understand in a certain way. Yeah, sure, nobody, I suppose, could make a proposition without some kind of language. But you're training yourself to combining your experience with that language. That went on many years ago when you grew up, right? So when mommy pointed to something and said that, thing, right? Sound. Then you combine sound with thing, right? But you had to have the thing in order to point and make the sound. You didn't make a lot of sounds and then all of a sudden some ontology dawned on you, right? How is this? How can they not see this, man, right?
Philosophers doing ontology.
Maybe it's because going to university and being a modern philosopher is all about talking, right? It's like I have to make a case for it, right? It's not my own experience. I have to argue and come up with words. I have to make words. So words must have an enormous power, right? Because all you maybe did was having words thrown at you for 5 or 6 years during university, right? It was a word tsunami, basically. Throwing you up against the philosophical wall, right?
You become really careful about what they assert to be true, because the act of asserting something commits them to the existence of the things they are talking about. This means that if they don't want to commit to the existence of dubious entities, they need to find ways of saying the things they think are true.
Okay, so if I came up with a new word, fnuginagi, right? Fnuginagi is a new word. What's the ontology I can reach with that word? Well, who the hell knows? I don't even know, but that's made a new word. Maybe it's not sufficiently new, but at least it sounds new to me, fnuginagi, right? Fnuginagi? I made a word. So there must be some ontology then. No, but why are there ontology then? If you say there's no ontology behind that word, it's because I just made it up. Well, who made all the other words up? Right? It's completely misguided, this, right?
True, without referring to them. The ultimate aim of this project is to construct a language that allows you to express all the truths that there are while only referring.
But all the truth. How do you approach this? What is the thinking behind this? All the truths that there are. Yeah, you can say the terms and appeal to it by using these terms. All the truths that there are. It's sort of they're lying around somewhere, right? Well, what are these truths? What is the definition of this truth? Yeah, to the best of my understanding, you haven't made a definition of what I mean by truth. But then somebody else has made the definition for you, or what? Then why don't you present that definition? Because you're using the term now, right? And if you're not defining it, why are you using the term without clarifying what you mean? Or you're just taking the chance that my understanding of what I mean by true is the same as yours. That's a bit of a chance to take, isn't it, right? Because to the best of my understanding, nobody in the fucking world has any idea. Or they may have an idea, but there's no consensus of what is meant by truth, right? And there's no consensus about any of these things, right? And the more abstract they get, like, reality and mind and existence, the more fluffy the thinking seems to be, right?
Referring to the entities that actually exist. Now, this language is a bit unwieldy and impractical for general use, but it is...
You're appealing also to a static world. There are these facts out there, done! Right? I'm not disclosing how I get to it, but I'm appealing to it. There's a certain scope of facts and I can go and look at them, right? Who knows, maybe some new shit appears, right? How the hell do you know that? What about the future of facts? Some fact may disappear, maybe, right? How species go extinct or whatever, right? 9/11, the Twin Towers disappear, right? A big pile of dust and all, right? I mean, it's incoherent, maybe, right? It's not. His presentation doesn't allow me to follow, a strictly ordered sequence of thinking where one thing leads to the next. He just throws in the ontology. Okay, what the hell is that, right? Why do I need to have that now? Yeah, you're talking ontology. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's supposed to be in this chain of argument, right? And what is the difference between ontology and idealism? Is that the same? So if you're talking about ontology, why are you not talking about idealism? And if idealism is something else than ontology, then what is idealism then as a category of thinking? It's just he's starting using words, right? He's been using words for half an hour, and now he's starting to talk about, well, we have to look at what words mean in order to get to ontology. Well, then you're creating basically a circular argument because you started out using words. Then I can't trust any of the words you used until now because you have to point them to some kind of ontology now, right? How does that work?
It's hoped it would be a very precise language that directly mirrored the way reality was. The contemporary philosopher Ted Seidel.
What is reality? What is it? Yes, I've heard the term before, but that doesn't mean that I necessarily understand what you mean by reality. It seems that there are as many understandings of reality as there are people trying to understand what they mean by reality. Somebody came up with the term reality, so now I have to explain what it is, because Quine says so.
Had a name for such a language. He called it ontologies. Here's an example of how this might work. Suppose you think that objects like tables and computers don't really exist in reality, because you think the only
really exists. So exist is something that goes on in reality. In reality, he's talking as if he is outside that reality. He's sort of questioning, does it or does it not exist in? So there's something outside, then inside-outside appeal. Is he the inside? And there's something outside, right? So you're not addressing why you're creating the dichotomy of an inside-outside. It's so complicated now that it's impossible to pin anything down what you're talking about, right? You're just blowing in the wind and throwing out words, right?
Things that really exist are the fundamental particles of standard model physics. Everything else you think is just a collection of particles. In that case, instead of saying something like, the computer is on the table, you might say something like, there are particles arranged computer-wise on top of particles arranged table-wise.
Okay, so now you create the term particle, right? Okay, so now we have a new term. Particle, right? What is that? What's the particle? You're just moving the definition around. Basically, all these people are doing.
That this new assertion.
This guy, Quine, he's referring to. He's just, now I defined it. So be satisfied with my definition. But what about the terms you use for the definition? Don't they need a definition? Or have you reached the bottom of your ontology or what? Your reduction base. These terms used to define this can't be defined any further. But what defines a particle? It's an abstraction. So you took something that I can actually experience and defined it by something I can't experience. I can't experience particles. So you create an abstraction in order to explain something that is not an abstraction. Bullshit, right?
doesn't talk about computers and tables. It only talks about particles and...
No, but now he's, and this is my, interpretation here, right? He's slowly moving towards a superstring of philosophy, right? It's like the idea of a superstring is in physics, that in order to combine everything into the small forces and the large forces and gravity and quantum mechanics, all this shit, creating a very little something that is unit, that is a string that can vibrate, and then create all the other shit you're experiencing, right? So it all comes together in the theory of everything called a superstring, right? This is sort of a philosophical approach to superstring. Well, let's talk about particles. Let's do this kind of reduction into a superstring. And then this superstring called mind is describing everything, right? But okay, if you want that, I'm not stopping you, right? But what the hell do I need it? If I go down to the grocery store looking for tomatoes, I'm not going to have to, okay, let me say there is some tomato-like particle on top of this tomato-like, box. Let me buy a tomato from my tomato-like money and or money-like particles, and this, this exit door and this, whatever, why do you need that? You don't need it. You need to cognize the fucking tomato. Is it true or is it false, right? Tomato or not tomato? And even the quality of it. Is it red and shiny or is it half green and brown, right? Yeah, it may be a tomato, but if it's half green on one of the sides, I'm not interested, right?
And how they happen to be arranged. So if you can have a language that replaces computer and table talk with talk about particles arranged in various ways, then you could conceivably express everything that you think is true without having to refer to things you don't think exist. Now, once this new language has been...
But why would you go around? Why would I go around in my everyday? I like to take an everyday scenario as a functional point of using philosophy, or my philosophy, right? Not necessarily your philosophy. But if I was standing there in the middle of town, right? What would I need? I mean, what would I need? Would I start to think about Quine's definition of being, right? Why would I need it? At the end of the day, it will all come back to that tomato. If that's what I'm going for. Let's say I'm going for the tomatoes. No matter what fancy story you can come up with that ends up being the tomato, at the end of the day, it's the fucking tomato I'm going for, right? If you don't, you're going to expire, right? Like the Monty Python parrot, right? The dead parrot, this used to be a parrot. This is a late parrot, right? This is a late philosopher. I was thinking more than eating, right? So it's like it's a kind of it's kind of the mind over matter thing with academics, right? My thinking is more important than my actual experience. I need to think about my experience before I can actually somehow trust my experience. Or at least he's alluding to that, right? And a lot of philosophers allude to that, right? And somebody end up in some crazy stories like Bernardo Kastrup about whatever he's thinking and experience is not really important. It's some metaphysical realm beyond himself that is important, though it doesn't know what the hell it's doing, but it wants him to do something, right? Is it getting into these mystic stories, right? And I'm like, back off, right? So just be careful, Mr. Nathan Hawkins, right? That you're not channeling your abilities to throw around words and be abstract in your thinking in order to dismiss what might actually be more important. I'm not telling you what to think, but thinking about your thinking is philosophy, but it's dangerous to stay in thinking and not living, right? Because at the end of the day, what is the purpose of this thinking? And it's all to structurize your first level thinking by using some kind of second level thinking in order to organize your first level thinking so that it's more functional, right? It's more ideal. It's less bad thinking in it, or bad understanding, and whatever, however you want to put it, right? But you have to go out in some kind of everyday reality where it can function. And it seems to me that some kind of philosophy is dysfunctional in the sense that it doesn't add anything to the picture. It doesn't scrutinize any of my prior thinking. And maybe even it just confirmation bias, right? If anything. And the rest of it is just pure, imaginary thinking that doesn't lead anywhere to anything that is functional, right? Why do I need idealism to buy a tomato? Well, if I put it like that, why do I need idealism to get my tomato? Do I? And if I don't need it to get my tomato, what do I need it for? Because I'm moving towards my kitchen or away from my kitchen. I'm moving towards my mouse, or away from my mouse. I'm grabbing my, water here, right? Drinking from my Duralex glass, and so on. I'm constantly cognizing shit from in all my waking hours, right? But apparently that's not important. No. Let me have a story called idealism, right? And I'm building an empirical case for it. Give me a fucking break, man, right?
Being constructed, you can then argue that this language is the one that correctly mirrors the structure of reality. In other words, you can...
Okay, the mirror the structure of reality. Well, where is that mirror? And if it's a mirror, yeah, you're calling it a mirror, and that is implying that it's a one-to-one representation of some kind. But first of all, how did you get the understanding that there was something outside your experiences? Because if all you have access to is your experiences, then that outside world can only be an imagination. Because if you have access to the idea of an external world, it must be an experience. Then it's not out beyond your experiences where that supposed external world is. So why are you saying, oh yeah, but now I'm saying that my experiences are mirroring, which is more like a one-to-one representation. That's a mirror, right? I'm the same person mirrored in there that I am actually. Maybe it's not the case because it's maybe a bit more complicated than that. But mirroring saves him from explaining that whatever you might experience possibly has nothing to do with what could potentially be a representation of an external world, right? How could you possibly know or get to that it's a mirroring? What does it mean that it's mirroring, right? These are the fundamental questions you need to address, mate. These are the interesting questions you need before you do all of the other shit way down the river, right? Start with this. How do you get to an external world? If that's what you're implying, please give me the argument, right? I would love to have that argument for an external world.
You can argue that this language is ontologies, and it is the true thoughts expressed in ontologies that are the ones that directly correspond to the facts. And so these true thoughts can tell you what the facts are. Simple, right? But now a new problem arises. No doubt there will be multiple theories that make all the same thoughts true, but do so by talking about different things. Let's go back to the computer on the table example. One theory might simply say the computer is on the table, in which case computers must exist and tables must exist. Another theory, however, might simply...
But what does it mean that they exist? I experience table. I could just, I just say table because I'm referring to a direct experience or an actual experience. I say the word table, and that's the experience I'm referring to, right? I don't need to call it table to have the experience of table, right? But if I experience what I call table, what does it mean that it exists? Why do I need to add the story to it? Yeah. Table. But does it exist? What do you mean exist? Because you have the experience, and then you ask the question, right? And the question is something you add to the story. It's basically some kind of philosophical story or something like that. Does it exist? Well, what the hell do you mean exist? You're referencing the word called existence or exist, but you're not disclosing what you mean. But you're allowed apparently to ask the question without any further clarification. What do you mean that it exists?
Please say that particles arranged computer-wise are on top of particles arranged table-wise, in which case particles exist, but tables and computers don't.
So now we have tipped it over. Don't trust your experience. Trust the idea of a particle, right? I came up with the idea of a particle. Some halfway to a superstring, right? So now we are getting rid of the tomatoes because they're fucking annoying qualia and cognitions, right? Let me stay in particle land. Because then I can live in my abstractions. I can fly off in my abstraction balloon and live in my abstractions, and then I feel safe.
But since we can imagine that both theories might be equally plausible in terms of what they say is true, how are we to know whether things like computers and tables exist? The answer would seem to depend upon which theory is the correct theory.
Oh my God. Oh man, this guy. Yeah, he's such a nice guy sitting there in his brown sweater, right? But he's just confused on a higher plane, right? He's talking to you as if he's sort of a professor, trying to ask the questions and then move the answers around and maybe make it rhetorical and not really getting anywhere and just throwing new terms in and mentioning another philosopher who's very important, right?
But how are we to know this? Now it gets really tricky.
Oh my God! Oh my God! As if it weren't. As if it weren't already quite tricky what he's doing, right? Now I would like to put the idea of ontology here. That's a term used more like a philosophical category, right? So, if there's some terms, the list is so long now that it doesn't really matter if another term is used, and it's like midstream philosophy, right? It doesn't work. It can't work. I'm not allowing it to work in my life, right? I wouldn't say, oh my God, now I understand tomatoes completely now, right? Because they're just particles and quine, and therefore, yay! And that's a theory. He's talking about theories again, right? Ontological realism? As I said a few times before this, right? In this series here, it's about twisting the words around, right? He's building a word Lego, right? He's taking this word and putting on top of this word and adding these together and creating something new, ontological realism. Oh my God, right? What could that be? Ontological realism. But you by doing ontology, this is my short version, right? By ontology, you're describing what you have in your experience. All the aspects of your experience, and describing interdependencies, if there are any. I would say there is, right? You're describing what is there. What is there is your ontology. What is there is your experience, right? All the other stories about external worlds and whatever, right? That's something you add to the picture. And if you add it, it's a part of your experience, right? As I say, it's an imagination somewhere down the line of your ontology. If there's a structure in your ontology, and there is a structure, that's why I called it ABC, right? In my ontology. Ontology is describing your experience and interdependencies. And when you've done that, You have added all these terms to the ontology so that you have an idea when you reference it in your own philosophy as you get further down the line to epistemology and ethics, maybe, right? What you're talking about. You're not deceiving yourself using fancy terms, right? But also, if you want to express what you're doing, as if, for instance, I'm doing or he's doing, you want there to be a grounded understanding of the terms used. That's why you have the ontology. That is where the terms used originate from. Right? And that's why you can't tip it around and say, I have a word, I have to direct it toward an ontology. Right? In order to create the ontology. Well, you could say that you're not creating ontology. The words are there to describe what is already there in your experience. The types of experiences you have. So be careful that you're not creating something you want because you're trying to connect the dots somewhere down the line to what you think you need to get to. For instance, some kind of moral principle or something like that. I have to make this ontology in order to get to that conclusion of my ethics, right? Then you're sort of confirmation bias and connecting the dots and creating a narrative or, subjective, what's it called? I don't mean subjective. You're going where you want to go, right? A narrative. You're justifying your own preconceived ideas of where it should lead. That's not good philosophy. So if you just wash the board clean and say, okay, all my ideas of philosophy and Plato and Nietzsche, everything going out the window, right? I am starting from my point of view because Nietzsche is just an idea I heard of, right? It's something in the supposed past I haven't even experienced, right? So let go of that. Where do you have to start? Well, there's nothing left but your experience. Then describe that experience because any further philosophy must be based on that experience. So if you create a further philosophy like definition, knowledge and so on, it has to refer back to some prior foundational philosophy, ontology and reduction base and whatever you have, right? That's it. It isn't really, the idea of it is not very complicated, but this guy complicates it. He's gone nowhere yet. And we are on the 33-minute mark, right? And now it gets more complicated. So he can just say, well, it's very complicated, so I just made, all right? Why? You don't bring in somebody else's philosophy in order to justify your own. You just start describing your philosophy. That seems to be, to me at least, showing that you're resting in your own philosophy. Bringing all these terms in and other philosophers and said, oh, that's a very important philosopher over there, right? It's no bearing on your philosophy, basically, right? You're just leaning up against some pre-established, it's an appeal to authority. These people are authorities on how to think, right? No, you are the authority on your thinking, right? Okay, see you in the next one.